Good morning and welcome to First Presbyterian Gastonia and our online new adult Sunday school series. I'm Craig Whitley and I'll be teaching this week. Today we're going to take a look at one of the most unconventional books of the Bible, the book of Esther. So don't close the video just yet. I will tell you it sounds gruesome, and perhaps it is, but it is a very interesting story, and it actually does have some good religious precepts in it that we want to cover. But before we begin with that, I'd like to ask you to join me in just a word of prayer. Almighty God, be with us today as we struggle to make sense of all that has happened to this old world of ours. Be with those who fear for their health, for those who fear for their lives, their jobs, their families. Give them fortitude and give them courage. Be merciful, God, to those who have lost loved ones and are suffering now. Ease their pain, comfort them. Be with our elected officials, O God. Grant them wisdom, the same wisdom you gave to Solomon, so that like Solomon they may govern justly. Help our leaders make good decisions that protect and keep your people. Be with those who are called to serve during this uncertain time, the healthcare workers, the truckers, the research scientists, members of law enforcement, and all those essential workers who go unnamed but risk themselves daily in order that the rest of us may be sustained. Bless them all, Lord, for their sacrifices, and please keep them safe. And finally, O God, please be with us today as we study your word and seek to discern your will. Open our eyes so that we may hear your message. Give us willing hearts and strong limbs so that we may act on what we hear. We pray for the fulfillment of your divine will and the glory of your kingdom yet to come. In Christ's name, amen. Well, Easter is over, and with it all those wonderful Lenten scripture verses that make for inspiring sermons and good Sunday school lessons. Today we're going to leave the well-tilled earth, the Isaiah, the Luke, the Matthew, and we're going to break some new and fairly rocky ground in the book of Esther, a Bible book which somehow manages over 9 chapters not to mention God, not to mention Israel, not to mention religion, religious principles, religious behavior, or even the exile, the period in which it is set. Technically, today's lesson comes from the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th chapters of Esther, but the fact is Esther is a single story, or perhaps you would call it a saga. So if we're to discern the message in a book that is set in a pagan land, we got to know the whole story. And with a good deal of abridgment, I'm going to try to just tell you what happened. Let me warn you that even by Old Testament standards, it is a wild tale. We're in the 5th century BC and set in the Persian Empire. You, of course, know the backdrop. In 721, the northern kingdom Israel falls to the Assyrians, and a while later, Jerusalem is sacked by the Babylonians. Between the two, the Jews are exiled. 50 years thereafter, it looks like that they have lost the land for good. But then something fortuitous happens because the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and the Persian king is Cyrus, a most unusual ruler indeed. Of course, he is a great general, but he's also a benevolent ruler, a good man, and one blessed with foresight, although we would say it was one influenced by God. Inexplicably, Cyrus lets the Israelites go home. He even finances their return. You know that as the book of Ezra. We would assume then that the Jews got up en masse and returned to Israel much as they did during the Exodus, but that's not true. Actually, only a small portion of the Jewish people went home from Persia. Most stayed right where they were. Why? Well, who knows? Some were just too comfortable to leave. Some were too afraid. This new generation, of course, had not been born in Israel, but in the foreign lands that they were in. They simply didn't know Israel. And by the way, Israel at that time was a fairly wild and woolly place. Lots of hostile tribes there. And that again, it comes from Ezra if you want to read that story. But meanwhile, many of the Jews had also forgotten who they were as a people and identified with the Persians, not with Israel. Many had forgotten their God as well. Our story of Esther begins then about 50 years after Cyrus. Persia is now ruled by Cyrus's grandson, whose name is Ahasuerus. You know him better as Xerxes I, and that's a lot easier to say, so I will. Regrettably, Xerxes is just not the man his grandfather was. He was more of the typical despot. I'll give you an example. When Xerxes comes to the throne, he celebrates by throwing a 6-month-long party throughout the land. During the revelry, Xerxes gets into a drunken argument with some foreign guests, arguing over who had the best-looking women. Xerxes wants to win his bet, so he summons his queen Vashti and plans to prove that Persian women are prettier than others. This might be forgiven, but Xerxes is willing to show a lot more of Queen Vashti to his guests than just her smile. When Vashti gets wind of this and refuses to appear, Xerxes decides that she has dishonored him, and he gives her the boot. So Xerxes is not a nice guy. He then embarks on a ill-advised invasion of Greece, which you doubtless have heard about. He's gone for 4 years. He wins at Thermopylae over the Spartans. He sacks Athens, but then he loses his fleet, and the chastened Xerxes has to return home to an empty palace. It's time to look for a queen, and that's where our story really begins. An empire-wide search ensues. The idea is to form a royal harem from the 400 prettiest maidens in the empire. And from that group over time, Xerxes will choose his new queen. It's a beauty contest Persian style. The contestants are selected and expected to audition without regard to whether they even wanted to be in the pageant. Among the Jews in that era was a man named Mordecai. Years ago, after his uncle and aunt died, Mordecai took in his kid cousin and raised her as his own daughter. Her name is Hadassah, or we would call her Esther, her Persian name. Now Esther at this point is a young woman, and you can see where this is going. She just happens to be strikingly beautiful and equally lovely in spirit. So when the king's recruiters come looking for women, they immediately select Esther. Esther would have preferred not to have been selected. It's not something she wanted, but she really has no choice. So she makes the best of a bad situation and goes to the citadel and enters the women's courtyard. At Mordecai's instruction, Esther tells no one that she is Jewish. Jews are definitely second or perhaps third-rate citizens in the empire. But Esther fares well in the Xerxes harem. Between her beauty and her charisma, she wins the favor of not just the king, but the entire court. And while he is not a romantic and not even a nice guy, Xerxes falls hard for Esther. He makes her queen. So all in all, a remarkable story. The orphan child of Jewish exiles is somehow raised up to become queen of one of the world's greatest empires. The sweetest lemonade is made from very bitter lemons, but you should hold on because the story's just starting. While all of this has been going on to Esther, Mordecai has also been climbing in Persian society. He's a successful businessman, but things really pick up for him after he gets wind of a plot to kill Xerxes, and he passes the word to Esther, who tells Xerxes, and the plot is foiled. With that, Mordecai becomes part of Xerxes' court. Assassination plots were a serious matter in those days, and very much later on, Xerxes will actually fall victim to one when one of his ruling leaders plots with his son to depose him. But back to our story. To have a drama, you need a bad guy, and in this case, that's a fellow named Haman. Haman's another up-and-comer at the Persian court. He's an Amalekite, one of those hereditary enemies of Israel. Perhaps that's why he and Mordecai never hit it off, but it also may be because Mordecai is a good man and Haman is a lout. Whichever, when Xerxes makes Haman his prime minister of Persia, the only person at court who refuses to bow is Mordecai. A very deeply insulted Haman then decides to kill Mordecai, and he becomes obsessed with the idea. Upon learning that Mordecai is a Jew, he decides not just to kill Mordecai, but all Jews who are in Persia. He even casts lots to determine the date, and the roll of the dice dictates that all of the Jews will be killed 11 months later in the month of Adar, which is March to those of us. If you're going to kill a bunch of the king's subjects, though, you need the king's approval. So Haman goes to Xerxes. He argues to him that the Jews are a threat to the realm. The Jews don't even follow the king's law, he says. Haman even offers a bribe to Xerxes if he will let him kill the Jews. Now, it's questionable whether Xerxes even knew what a Jew was. There were thousands of nationalities in the empire, and Xerxes, of course, didn't get out much to mingle with his subjects. We do know that Xerxes did not know that his beloved Queen Esther was Jewish, nor did Haman for his part. But Xerxes isn't such a nice guy. He tells his trusted advisor Haman that he may do with those people whatever he pleases, no bribe required. The king's decree goes out into the kingdom throughout the land, ordering that the Jews be killed 10 months hence, which begs a question not answered in the text, why the rest of the Jews didn't bolt to Israel at that point. But they didn't. Instead, the Jews despair. They rent their clothing, they weep, Mordecai among them. Even though he was the one who precipitated Haman's anger, a stubborn Mordecai will not try to mend fences. He won't beg Haman to reconsider the edict. Instead, he sends a message to Esther and asks her to again intervene with the king. On this occasion, Esther doesn't think she can stop Haman. Haman has Xerxes' confidence, and he has access to the king on a daily basis. By contrast, even though queen, Esther lives in the women's quarters at the palace. She only sees the king when he summons her. So Esther sends back word to Mordecai. This plan won't work. Anyone who goes to the king uninvited is usually put to death. And by the way, I'm not likely to be invited. The king hasn't asked for me in a month. But there are no other options. So Mordecai presses Esther. He says, look, you can't stand on the sidelines. If you don't act now for the Jews, someone else will. But Mordecai is less certain as to what will happen to Esther. Her fate will be decided by what she does next. So he turns the screw a bit and suggests that this crisis might be the reason that fate has put Esther in the queen's role. All Esther knows for her part is that she's going to be putting her life in jeopardy. Not only is approaching the king without sanction a death sentence, she's going to have to admit that she is Jewish to the king who just ordered that all the Jews might be killed. So effectively, she is really begging for trouble here. Nevertheless, Esther relents. She says she will go to the king. She just asks that the rest of the Jews fast for 3 days and think of her. This is the only religious act that we find in the book of Esther, and even then it's elliptical. But 3 days later, Esther dons her best robe and stands across the courtyard where the king can see her from his throne. Xerxes does. He smiles at his beloved wife and invites her over. He then asks, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half of the kingdom. Have you ever bass fished with a plastic worm? It works like this. The bass likes to nibble at the first on the end of the worm. The trouble is the hook's on the other end. So if at the first time you get a bite, you jerk your rod, you catch nothing. You've got to give the fish time to chew on the worm and think things over a bit. Then when he gets to feeling good about his meal and takes the whole worm in his mouth, well, then you jerk. Esther must have been a born fisherman. Instead of just going to Xerxes and blurting out that she's a Jew and asking him not to kill the Jews, a request that would likely have been denied out of hand, she instead invites the king and Haman to a banquet at her quarters. At that banquet, a very pleased and entirely smitten king asked Esther for a second occasion, what is it that you want? It shall be done. But again, Esther demurs. Rather than answer directly, she invites Xerxes and Haman to a second banquet at her quarters. She's letting the king nibble the worm a bit. Meanwhile, Haman has been feeling pretty good about himself. He alone among the court has been invited to feast with the royals, not once, but now twice. He's thinking he's some big shakes. He's probably also thinking that he's pretty close to the throne at this point, and he might be thinking what he would do with it if he could become king. He's in a great mood. But that mood is shattered as he leaves the palace and passes Mordecai. Once again, Mordecai fails to bow to Haman. Haman's livid. He goes home and decides to move up the date of Mordecai's death from 10 months from now to now. Unaware that the queen is Mordecai's adopted daughter, Haman plans to ask Xerxes the next day for permission to hang Mordecai. He's so confident Haman even has the gallows built. But this latest plot goes awry. That night the king couldn't sleep and sends for a servant and asks him to read for him. There must not have been many Lynn Elmore books lying around the palace, because the only thing the servant can find is a chronicle, a Persian history or records book. He begins to read at random, and surprise of all surprise, the passage ends up describing the occasion when Mordecai once foiled an assassination plot against the king. Xerxes is moved, and he decides that he must reward Mordecai. So the next day, Haman comes to court thinking about murdering Mordecai at the very same time that the king is thinking of how to honor Mordecai. And before Haman can say a word, Xerxes asks him, "How should I honor a great servant?" In his vanity, Haman presumes Xerxes is talking about himself. So he gives the king his own wish list. Well, an honored servant should receive a royal robe and one of the king's prize horses. And oh yeah, a parade led by a high-ranking prince. Xerxes loves the idea and tells Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do this for Mordecai." A shocked Haman has no choice but to obey. He is forced by the king to publicly honor his sworn enemy, the one that he would have had killed that day. And Haman's day isn't over. He still has to go to Esther's second feast. The second banquet is even more sumptuous than the first, and the king is even more smitten with his queen. And then for the third time, Xerxes asks Esther, "Ask me for whatever you want. I will grant it." This time, Esther summons up her courage. She tells Xerxes that someone is about to destroy her and her people. She wisely doesn't say who her people are, and she doesn't name the person who's going to destroy them. She simply asks the king to save her and save them. In fishing, before you set the hook, it's always good to drop the tip just a bit. That way when you jerk, you get more whip on it. As it turns out, Esther's elliptical ask is just perfect. Xerxes is outraged to hear that someone intends to kill his queen. He demands the name. And now it's time for Esther to set the hook. She says the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman, and she points. The king is shocked. Then he becomes livid. He realizes his queen is a Jew, and that his right-hand man Haman has talked him into killing all the Jews. Xerxes assumes that Haman knew that Esther was Jewish, and he presumes that Haman was seeking permission to kill the Jews simply as pretext to kill his queen. In short, Xerxes thinks Haman has betrayed him. A furious king stalks out into the garden. Haman, on sight, is terrified. He actually didn't know that Esther was Jewish, and his plot to kill the Jews had nothing to do with her. It was about trying to get even with Mordecai, and he didn't know Mordecai was related to Esther. But there's no explaining any of that to Xerxes in his mood. So instead of following Xerxes into the garden, Haman stays inside and intends to beg Esther for his life. Haman's day is about to hit rock bottom. As he goes to plead, he trips over a bench and ends up falling on top of the queen. At that precise moment, the king walks back into the room. He sees Haman laying on top of the queen. Now Xerxes is totally out of his mind. With Haman's plot uncovered, the king assumes that the treacherous Haman has still the gall to assault the queen. Not good. Not good at all for Haman. The king summarily has Haman executed, and ironically he does it on the gallows that Haman intended for Mordecai. So now Xerxes is entirely on the side of the Jews. He gives Haman's home to Esther, and his position as prime minister goes to Mordecai. But what about the Jews? Esther asked the king to rescind the death sentence, but it turns out a royal edict can't be vacated once issued. Xerxes offers another solution. He will issue a second decree that on the appointed days, 10 months hence, the Jews may kill their attackers. And 10 months later, the Jews, with the help of the provincial governors, after all, now Mordecai is prime minister, they slaughter their enemies, 75,000 in all. Afterwards, the Jews rest and they feast, and that gives rise to the Feast of Purim, a tradition that is celebrated by the Jewish people today. Well, that's the story. You'll probably agree with me that as the Bible books go, Esther's pretty far out there. Doesn't mention God, worship, or prayer, but also the conduct of the participants, including Esther and Mordecai, is not always exemplary. There's lots of plotting, there's lots of murder. Xerxes would dishonor his first queen to win a drunken bet. We find Haman to be a schemer and a psychopath. Mordecai, of course, is much better, but his stubborn refusal to honor his superior, Haman, puts all of the Jews at risk. And even Esther isn't above reproach. I forgot to tell you, when the Jews were not able to kill all of their enemies on the one appointed day that the king sanctioned, Esther goes back to the king then and gets permission for a second day of mass murder so that they can finish the job and kill them all. As a bonus, she asked that Haman's 10 sons be impaled and hung up on the city gate. So, with all that and the less than honorable behavior of the participants, the book of Esther has never been really popular with religious groups. There was strong opposition to the book being included in the Jewish Bible way back in the day. Luther, for his part, decried Esther for having heathen naturalities. He wished it had never been written. Meanwhile, Calvin never preached on Esther, and though he wrote commentaries on more than 40 books in the Bible, Calvin never wrote on this. And at a much lower level, for my part, I can't remember ever reading the book of Esther. That is, until I prepared for this lesson. Have you? But for all its faults, I will say that there are some theological nuggets to be mined in the book of Esther. The first one is the one that the Uniform Lectionary series takes. Today's message has been entitled that injustice will be punished. They start with the saw that no good deed goes unpunished, and I can get behind that. If you ever volunteer to teach Sunday school by video on the Sunday following Easter, and then realize that you've drawn the book of Esther, you certainly understand that aphorism. But the lectionary writer's actual premise is sound. He's saying that, or she is saying that no evil deed goes unpunished by God. While it seems that evil can have the upper hand, God's justice prevails. The book of Esther certainly demonstrates that. Haman plotted to kill Mordecai and the Jews. Despite his cunning and royal sanction, he fails. God's will, Mordecai's persistence, Esther's bravery, they all turn the tables on Haman, leading to first his humiliation and then his death. So in the first instance, Esther is a reminder that God sees what people do, that he punishes the evil and the evildoers, and there is a judgment. That's certainly true, but it's hardly news to Christians, from Noah with the flood destroying the iniquitous, to Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah being razed, to Hezekiah, where the Assyrians were struck down overnight by the angel of the Lord, to John the Baptist, wheat being gathered but chaff being burned in an unquenchable fire, even to the teachings of Jesus, with wide gates leading to destruction in Matthew, and slaves who abused their master's trust being destroyed in Luke, and many other occasions. The principle is made time and again in the Bible. God's judgment and the punishment of the wicked are core Christian beliefs. And that's something we should all bear in mind, not just those that we would deem to be wicked. Plain simple fact is we're all sinners. We all face God's judgment, and none of us can withstand that judgment. but for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But the punishment point is probably one better made on another day. This isn't really the time to dwell on punishment of the wicked. Today, humanity faces random sickness, possible mass death at the hands of an invisible virus that we don't understand and we don't have the means to cure. Half the world is sitting at home today, and even those who were spared from sickness and death are facing the loss of their jobs, loss of their businesses, an uncertain future, possible financial ruin. So today I'd say instead that we're in need of the second message in Esther, not the first. And that message is this: God looks after his own. He's at work in this whole world, even in those times when we forget to call his name, even when we aren't acting our best, even when we can't see and realize and appreciate what he is doing. We are the children of a loving God, a God who has a plan for the world, a plan for us. And because of that plan, notwithstanding the threat of illness, death, or financial ruin, I would tell you the world is still in good shape. And that is so because by God's grace and the sacrifice of Christ Jesus, we all still have the prospect of salvation. It is simply ours for the asking. It may be that in this book, that in Esther, God is not named. But if you look at the book as a whole, you see a concern by God for the welfare of his people, the Jews. He caused Queen Vashti to be put aside and improbably for Esther to succeed her. He caused Esther to win the love of a king who knew little about love. He caused Mordecai to foil an assassination plot against Xerxes. These events would later cause Xerxes to side with the two of them and against his right-hand man Haman. So too God caused Haman not to immediately kill the Jews, but with a roll of the dice to get them an 11-month reprieve in which to prepare. God steered Esther in making her plea to Xerxes for mercy and caused her to do it in a way that was effective. Had she simply at the outset gone to Xerxes and made her request, it doubtless would have been turned down. Those daily banquets made Xerxes realize how much he loved Esther. Her reticence to ask for anything made him trust her, and thus once she asked for something, it made Xerxes realize how essential her request was. Similarly, God used insomnia in a random reading just to remind the king how much he owed his servant Mordecai. God caused Haman to precipitously move up Mordecai's death to the date of Esther's second feast, thereby exposing Haman as not just a threat to the Jews, but also to the king. And God must have had a hand in causing Haman to trip over Esther's divan and leading the king to think that Haman was assaulting her. You consider the many fortuities. Esther demonstrates that God manages the affairs of men, even men that aren't good men, even without their knowledge and ours. It's also clear that God has not abandoned his people. He does not. Throughout their history, whether ruled by Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, or Romans, God preserved the Jewish people. It's a strong thread that runs through post-exilic Jewish literature. It runs through our Bible, and we can see it also in Esther. It's also a point that we should trust God. That comes out of Esther loud and clear. Esther and Mordecai knew they couldn't thwart Haman. Their only hope was to appeal to the king. So Esther took a big chance. She appealed to the inner goodness in a king who was not so good himself. We, by contrast, have a God who is infinitely more powerful than any mortal king, and a God who is infinitely good. We may safely take our problems, whether they're viruses, financial disasters, or other problems, to God with the confidence that we will be heard. Another message that comes out of this is not just that God has a plan, but we are expected to be participants in that plan. We're to help make it happen. Mordecai had warned Esther that if you remain silent, relief and deliverance from the Jews will rise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Mordecai could have been talking to us all. God had given Esther many gifts, beauty, charm. He put her in the right place at the right time, made her Xerxes' queen, and he did it with a purpose. Similarly, God has given each of us gifts in aid of his plan. And if we will just simply look, you will realize that he has positioned us as well to help further that plan. I can't stress that enough. This world was in bad enough shape before the pandemic. There were a lot of things that needed to be done, a lot of problems to be solved. I would dare say that before the scourge ends and the follow-on financial difficulties abate, things might just get a lot worse. I will tell you, though, with confidence that God means to ease that human suffering, and he means to do it through you and through me. And that will take courage on our part. Esther had said to Mordecai that she would go to the king even though against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She was willing to die to save her people. She risked all. As modern Christians, we don't much like risk, but Esther shows us that sometimes we have to take chances. Just ask those healthcare workers who for the last month or so have been going into the hospitals throughout the world to treat the sick, even when they're masked or used, even when they don't have the proper equipment. Want to try closer to home? At the moment, I'm sitting in the federal courthouse in Charlotte. You may have read in the paper this week about one of our staff people, the cleaning lady in our courthouse. For the last 2 weeks, she, between criminal hearings, has been sanitizing all the counsel tables and the witness stands so that hearings and the participants may be safe. Those participants are not just lawyers, they're people that are arguably criminals. This lady, Georgette, is not what you would call a hero. You'd never get her to admit that. What she is an ordinary person who's putting it on the line for the protection of others, even the least of these. Taking risks sometimes is our job as Christians. And finally, I would say to you that those risks also involve us proclaiming who we are as Christians and God's people. It was certainly a risk for Esther to tell Xerxes that she was a Jew, but it saved her people. It's not really fashionable these days to publicly proclaim Christ, but it's still as necessary as it was in her day. Jesus warned us in Matthew 10, "What I tell you in darkness, you must speak in the daylight. And what is whispered in your ear, you must shout from the housetops." So I would say to you that if we are to be saved, and if the world is to be saved, we, like Esther, must tell the world who we are. In our case, we are Christians, children of a God with a plan, and we mean to help. So that's it. The book of Esther. It's a book that doesn't talk about God, but obviously has some hidden godly messages. I thank you for your time and for listening to me today. Next week, April 26th, Ellen St. Mars will present the lesson. She'll be speaking on Isaiah 61 and God's love for justice. I hope you'll watch. Have a good day.